What's the last thing you remember? What's the last thing you remember? You ever thought about that phrase, what's the last thing you remember? Why do people have so much emphasis on the last thing you remember? Why is that last thing so important? Why does it matter so very much? When you're trying to remember something, why do they start you with the end and then work their way back from there? If you ever have a case of amnesia where you can't remember something, people trying to get you to remember things will say, what's the last thing you remember? It's because it's natural to start at the end and build your way back from there. Because you remember best the thing you heard last. And it's the same thing with your speeches. You may have a beautiful, fantastic beginning. Great stuff in the middle, very, very clever. And then you just slap some sort of ending together and you're done. What do people remember? That crummy ending you slapped together. They think, not sure quite what that speech was about. Just remember, I hated the ending. Ending is so very important. So challenging, so difficult, and yet so very important. Perhaps you struggle with the endings. Perhaps you struggle trying to figure out what sort of ending you should put together, how should you end it, what's the right way, and wondered, is there a formula? Is there a way to put together a good ending? Or you just kind of throw something together and hope that it works? Well, the good news is there is a formula. There is a formula for a good ending. And you don't need to worry about whether or not it's going to work, because it will work. It's the basic formula used for every ending, and yet many, many speakers don't know it, don't understand it, or if they do know it, don't fully use it. They'll use a little bit here and there of the formula, but not the full thing, so they don't get the full effect. As a result, audiences who hear these speakers find that there's something missing. They don't enjoy the speeches. Afterwards, they can't really remember what was said. Can't really remember why that bothered. And unfortunately for those speakers, the audiences walk away with nothing. And 2, 3, 4, 5 days later, that speech is gone from their mind. Because people remember best the thing they heard last. And if the last thing they heard was something forgettable, then they just forget it. Put it out of their mind. So that's why today we're talking about endings. Specifically the conclusion of your speech. And the 3 things you need to do for the conclusion. If you don't use these things, people won't understand what your speech was about. They won't remember it. And if you're stumbling to your conclusion, they certainly won't like it. I wonder why they even bother to listen. And they certainly won't want other people to listen to what you have to say. But if you do understand these 3 things, everything kind of comes together. Everything starts to make sense. Because people say, oh, okay, that's what it was about. I get it. I understand now. 3 simple things you can do to have a powerful conclusion that leaves an impact in your audience long after when you've actually finished the speech. And the first thing for a successful conclusion is something that many speakers don't do. And because they don't do it, the audience gets confused. Because this thing isn't done, the audience is confused. They don't know what's going on. And they don't know whether or not it's time to pay attention. You see, shocking as it may be, not everybody pays attention all the way through your speech. Sometimes they're looking for something very specific to tell them that it's now time to pay attention. And if they don't get that little cue, they never start listening. And the speech is over before they know that it was actually time to listen and pay attention. If you do use this simple step, the audience will know, hey, now's the time to focus in. Now's the time to be aware. Now, you do realize, of course, you want them to focus into your entire speech. But people's attention span is limited. And some people limit their attention span waiting for a very specific thing. You give them that thing, and they're going to pay very close attention. Because they know something is happening here that's very important for them to be aware of. Something that, if they don't catch it right, it'd be a real problem and a waste of their time. You give them that thing they're waiting for, and you will have a very focused in audience. You may have thought some of the people weren't with you. You're right. But you give them what they want, and all the people there focused in. What that is that you indicate you're concluding. Indicate you're concluding. Now, why is this so important to indicate you're concluding? Because some people are simply waiting to hear that you're done, that you're finished. That's all they really want to know. Okay, you're finished. All right, I'm going to pay attention now. Because the whole thing is over, and I figure this is now the time to at least pay attention. People will pay attention to the end of things. Remember, people remember best what they hear last. So once you indicate you're concluding, that's the cue for some people to pay attention. What that means is you have to indicate you're concluding. Many speakers just slide right to their conclusion, and they pride themselves in transitioning. And they're halfway through the conclusion before the audience even knows they've begun concluding. That's a problem. So those audiences were just waiting, those people in the audience were just waiting for just let me know what's going on. It's very simple. Just indicate you're concluding. Some simple phrases. Now, to wrap this up, tie a bow on all of this. In conclusion, finally, we have seen all of these are useful phrases to indicate you're concluding your speech. Use any of those phrases and your audience will pay attention. The ones you thought you'd lost suddenly will zoom in. Because they know, okay, it's over. This is the last thing I'm going to hear. I'm now going to pay attention. People remember best what they hear last. And if you have a long speech, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, not everybody pays exact attention all the way through. But when they hear that in conclusion, to wrap things up, let's finish this off. Any of those types of expressions, people will pay attention, zoom in, because they know you're concluding. So most important, that first thing, indicate you're concluding. Once you've finished the first step, just letting the audience know you're about to close, it's time to get to that important second step of concluding, closing. Now, many speakers don't use the second step. If they use the first step, they probably don't use the second step. Because the second step is considered too easy, too simple, old hat. It's just not an interesting way to do things. And they're afraid with the second step that maybe it doesn't get enough mystery or pizzazz. But the problem is, if you omit that second step, the audience doesn't get what they're looking for. Once you reach the second step and you give them the second step, the audience gets what they've been waiting for. They get the very thing that they were so concerned about not missing. The very reason why you said, hey, I'm about to close, they're going to get in that second step if you give it to them. So you give them what they want in that second step of the close, and all of a sudden, they're with you. They're paying attention. They're focusing on your every word. Now is the time when you really have the entire audience. And if you use the second step of the close, then you really get them, and they really get focused and interested in what you're saying. And the second step is call back the speech. Call back the speech. Just go over all the points you've covered. Here's the first point. Here's the second point. Here's the third point. Here's why the first point is so important. Why the second point is so important. Why the third point is so important. Call that back. Because some people, they're just waiting for that conclusion because they know it's the last chance to get what you have to say. So when you recap everything you have to say, it's that last chance they have to understand it. And when you recap everything you have to say, sometimes that's the first time people get it. It's that compact delivery. Instead of this big, long speech, now everything's very clear. Okay, here's the essence of the first step. Here's the basics of the second step. Here's the basics of the third step. It's all together. It's all compact. And calling back your points in your speech, calling back the speech at the end helps people understand what you're talking about, what the whole speech was about. And that's a chance for them really to get what it is you have to say. To really get it, to really understand it. And that only happens when they're able to go through the part 1, the part 2, the part 3. Because you have those short little sections, people can start seeing how it all connects together. Ah, that's how part 1 leads to part 2, leads to part 3. So when you do the callback to the entire speech, and you quickly go through your points, that's the time people can pay attention and think, okay, now I've got to focus in because this is the last chance I have to get it. This is it, last chance. Now I can focus in because now I understand how all of these things fit together. Some people will get it going through your whole speech. Others, it'll take that last moment, that calling back of the speech, and they finally understand how everything all fits together. And that'll be the time they get it. So, the second step, doing your conclusion, is to call back your speech. And now, we're almost there. The speech is almost done. Everything's almost finished. But if you miss this third, final step, you miss the opportunity to really reach your audience. And it goes back to something we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. There's something very special that happens in the conclusion. And if you leave that out, your audience misses out, and you as a speaker aren't doing a good job with your audience. Because you've left out, maybe not the most important thing, but the thing that's going to mean the most. If you leave in that third step and work on that third step and develop that third step, then things come together. Then there's something that happens, almost a magic that happens with the audience because of what you do in that third step, the conclusion. The last thing you do with the conclusion, the last thing you do that just kind of makes everything come together, kind of makes everything work, and really, you might argue, is the speech itself. This third very important step of the conclusion. Making sure you do it is very important because the third step, and final step, the conclusion, is to leave them with a lasting point. Remember at the very beginning I mentioned the thing you remember best is the thing you hear last. The conclusion is so open, so important for that reason. It's the last thing you hear. It's the thing that sticks in your mind. It's the thing that vibrates in your head. So naturally, the last words you hear are the most important. Just as the conclusion's the most important part of the speech because it's what people remember last. So the last words you have of the conclusion, that's what people carry away with them. So think about it. Think about creating something that's going to be memorable, interesting, stick in the mind, something people are going to take with them and remember long after your speech is over. Now this can take a little bit of work, a little bit of study, and thinking about it. Because the question is, how do you plant something in someone's mind so it keeps on going? Well, some people use stories. A story is a possibility. A story can stick in the mind. Or you can use some sort of analogy. Analogy where you describe something in terms of something else. So like an activity. Do something with the audience. Or some special acronym. It stays in the mind. Whatever you do, just make sure it's something that's going to last, going to stick with the audience. Because it's the last thing they're going to hear. It's the last thing you say. You want it to be memorable. You want it to be important. You want it to last. There's a reason why they talk about something that lasts. They call it the last. The lasting thing lasts because it comes last. So very important, those last words. Think about them, work on them, try different things, see what works, what doesn't, get some feedback. Because that really is the core of your speech. That point you want to get across. The lasting statement, that lasting sentiment. Getting that across to your audience is so very, very important. And getting a good lasting statement, something that sticks in the mind, whatever it is, it's important to really round out, fully in your conclusion. So create a conclusion, a final statement that lasts in the minds of your audience. And now, to wrap things up, to conclude, to finish, to put it all on a ball, to cover everything, to go over what we've been talking about. As promised, this is the conclusion. Wrap everything up. And as you notice, it follows the format that I mentioned during this entire talk. This is the time to wrap things up. So I'm telling you all, I'm wrapping things up. Last chance to get what I'm talking about. Now, as you know, go over the different parts. Part 1. Tell them you're going to conclude. Say something that indicates you're going to conclude, you're going to finish. This is it. Last chance to get whatever they're going to get out of it. That's the first step of the conclusion. Tell them it's going to conclude. Because some people will only pay attention to the conclusion. So if you're one of those people, now's the time to pay attention. Tell them they're going to conclude, how it's going to conclude. Get their attention. Say, no, that this is it. This is the finish. And then the second part. Go over the different parts. That's what we're doing right now. Going over the different parts. Step 1, step 2, and a little bit I'm going to mention step 3. So important. Having promised I'm going to conclude, now I'm going to give you what you need to know, what you need to take with you. And that is, in this case, step 2. Naming the different parts of what he's talked about. Going over the whole speech. Summarizing the entire speech in a few words, focusing on each part. Part 1, now part 2. And a little bit, part 3. And in giving the parts, just a high-level review of what you talked about. Very high level. Some people, maybe the first time they pay attention. But this is their one chance to get it. So make the parts clear and understandable. Make the summary of your speech. Break down it, whether it's in different steps, different ideas, different concepts, whatever it is, go over a very high-level view of all of these things. And then finally, comes to the conclusion itself. That lasting point you want to get across, that lasting meaning, that chance to really tie everything in a nice little bow and leave them with something that lasts. The last thing lasts. That's what it's all about. They call it the last because it's going to last. It's that simple. That's the power of the very last thing mentioned. Try to make it memorable. Maybe make it a story, or an acronym, or an analogy, or an activity, or something else that's going to last with the audience. No matter how good your speech is, it all comes down to that conclusion. If the conclusion is weak, confused, or people don't even know you're concluding, they're not going to pay attention, and they'll miss your whole speech point. The last thing lasts. Be aware of what the last thing you say is. Because in any presentation, it's a great privilege to talk to the audience. And many people you talk to, you'll never hear from again. You only have one chance to get that message out. Only one chance to make that message stick. Only one chance to make that message last. So give some real thought to conclusion. Give some real thought to what you say last, because the last thing lasts.